Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. My guest today is Dr. Jean-Jacques Wang, and he is going to be talking about how brain-gut interactions affect our eating behaviors. I'm so excited. I'm so interested in this topic. Please welcome him to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so excited. If you want, you can jump right into your presentation. But if you'd like, you could tell our viewers how you first got interested in this subject.
Okay, I would talk about that during my talk. And actually, my talk is including that part. So I will start my talk by introduce my agenda today. So I have three goals to let you share my research with you. The first one is which brain circuits are involved in obesity and the desire to eat. Secondly, gut-brain interaction of the appetite regulation. Finally, I will discuss our ongoing brain imaging research for obesity treatment.
Sounds good.
Obesity is a global health issue. Currently, over 2.1 million overweight, obese people globally. WHO defines obesity as a disease. Obesity accelerates the cancer, metabolic diseases, cardiovascular disease also will affect our brain cognitions. So let me summarize first about my content. Obesity is associated with brain changes, including stronger brain responses to food cues, more food cravings, lack of control of overeating, and increased perception of hunger. Obesity also impairs memory of how much we eat. For many years, we observed that overeating behavior in people with obesity is very similar to compulsive drug use behavior in people with substance use disorder. Illicit drugs affect how our brain releases dopamine, and dopamine is a chemical that allows our brain cells to communicate with each other. So this is a cartoon showing that the dopamine neuron, and so dopamine neuron release the dopamine as communicators to the dopamine receptor, and then after that you reuptake and recycle. And however, drugs such as cocaine, it will block this reuptake site as such that the dopamine stay, and then the people use the cocaine will feel very strong effect of this euphoria or the excitement from the effect of the drugs. So dopamine is important in that our movement, motivation, reward, and well-being. It also involved with our habit formation and addiction. So when we eat and when we see the food, our brain would release a little bit of dopamine. Then when we start to chew it, swallow it, and then the dopamine release is roughly around increase another 50%. However, the drug is different. Drug it would enhance dramatically almost 10 times for some of the drug of the dopamine into the brain. And the dopamine neuron is somewhere in the middle of the brain. They protrude their innervation to the frontal cortex or the area called nuclear accumbens. That is our reward center. So we use that medical device called positron emission tomography. That is a device that would help us to allow us to see how our body pick up the sugar or chemicals such as dopamine. Then we inject the tracer, and then the machine, this PET scanner, will pick up the signal, and then we'll use a computation method to generate the images. For example, this one is so-called dopamine receptor imaging. And for many years, I studied my career study that substance use disorder since 1990s. In the beginning, we study a lot of that people, they use the cocaine. And this is the images showing the dopamine images I showed you before. And this is that with a higher activity or lower activity. That means that this control has a higher bindings of this the tracer into the basal ganglia. That area has most of these receptors. However, the people, they have the issue with the drug use disorder issues. And then you can see that instead of red, they're into the yellow and the green. So that means that they have the less of the dopamine. So that means that a healthy person, they should have so much of the receptors, and then they get a very good signal to the reward circuit. However, when the person become a substance use with a substance use disorder, they have less receptors, and then they can only receive so much of the dopamine as such that their signal to other part of the brain become less. So they don't feel so much rewarding anymore. And then we studied that the obese person in the late 90s, and we published in the early 2000. We found that very dramatically that shown that obese person, they show very similar to people with a substance use disorder. They also have less of the dopamine receptor in their brain compared to a person with a normal body mass index. And then we try to see how this signal they produce from this dopamine, they reach into our brain, and how would that happen? And then how the people with obesity, their brain looks like after many years of the overeating behavior. And we found that in the brain, usually when we are in a very quiet situation, we are daydreaming, and our brains continue working. It's not we brain just stop. Our brain still working. So our brain into this area called default mode network is very active. Then if we see something coming, so then our brain immediately will pick up by this network, we call it the stimulus recognition network. They pick up the signal and then send the signal to the brain area that called a decision-making network, and then we start action. However, the people with obesity, they have alteration in these systems as such that they might contribute to their higher craving for food and greater perception of hunger and the lack of control of overeating. And subsequently, we try to understand more about how it happens. So we need to do some kind of challenging test by using a test we call delay discounting test. And this is a test that's been used to assess inhibition control. And so what that means is that we show a picture of the good food, and the food like a high caloric food. And then we ask that the person in the scanner, we say that would you rather to have this? If you want to have it, you get $20. However, if you prefer to eat it in 2 weeks, not now, then you will receive $100. And then that, so this is keep on and on, and we have 42 trials. And what we find is very interesting is that the people with obese, they have the light up in several brain areas. And those areas related to our decision-making area, I showed you before. Right? So we also found that the subject with obesity prefer to eat right away rather than waiting. For them, eating is a bigger reward than exercise is. So it's very interesting that based on this study would let us recognize that how we eat is affected by what our brain tells us, but also what our gut tells us. So this is that the cartoon to show in our brain, I showed you before, in the top part of the cartoon showing that the so-called reward system, and that involved with that our decision making and react to that the cue, react to the task. And this is an area we call that our hedonic system. We also have a small area of the brain that relate to our energy homeostasis. And we call that located in hypothalamus. So when we eat the food would into our guts, and then our guts would digest it, and then release that the nutrition into our body, and then also into the guts, and then our gut bacteria start to doing their works, and then try to metabolize and become so-called metabolites. They have small particles, and then they will absorb and go through the blood, and some of them into the brain, and or go through the nerve system or our immune system and reach the brain. And then that's how the gut and brain communicate. Because of what I just share with you is in the brain. So we know that it's the body and the brain is communicate each other. And so that we want to know where the signal from and how it affects our brain. So we use that a model that's been used for the treatment of the severe obese population. And these are the two procedures called bariatric surgery is considered the most effective to treatment of the severe obesity. And one of them is a bypass surgery by move the guts and attach to a small portion of the stomach. The other one is right now it's getting more popular is remove this big chunk of the stomach I show you here, and then only keep like a tube in the stomach like a tube, and then they make it in there. And then that and it's this. The area being removed, we call that greater curvature, is the main region of the stomach that contain the ghrelin producing cells. And ghrelin is the only one hormone outside the body that makes you feel hungry. And so we use that bariatric as a model. We think that is an ideal model to investigate the gut-brain interaction, because that you're going to eat less, and then that then it's kind of like make your brain kind of recovery, and then you will see the other side of the obesity. So bariatric surgery is considered is most effective compared to a lot of diet control. Why is considered effective? Because that it has a much decrease of the perceived hunger. As I mentioned to you, it decreased the ghrelin, and ghrelin is that the hormone make you feel hungry. It decreased. And another thing also very important is also increase that glucagon-like peptide are released from the small intestine, and that is being used on the drug treatment. So with all these, that combination is make bariatric surgery is very effective for those people they need surgery as a treatment. So our study shown that up to a year that when the person they receive that the sleeve gastrectomy, and then that they have a significantly decreased their body mass index because they have reduced their excessive body weight. And then another very important is that a month after the surgery, they have decreased their food craving. So we subsequently follow up the patients to see how the progress of their the recovery from the surgery. We check them at 1 month, 6 months, and 12 months. So we did that MRI at 1 month after the surgery to assess the brain function in the resting state. So that means that the person was lying on the scanner, and then we see how their brain, the blood flow changes. And we found that as when the surgery a month, the grading level decreased, right? So lower the grading level, which will improve how we form and maintain the new memory, because that the area with our long-term memory area called hippocampus, they drop, and then that they have can have the chance to develop the new memories. And in the resting system is in our brain, I mentioned you called the formal network, also more active, that lower our anxiety level and also have the less straight eating. And 6 months after the surgery, we did an MRI study to see how brain responds to food cues. Again, we found the lower grading level, which improved your brain controls your eating behavior, and also has ability to more easily suppress urge to eat high-calorie food. And 1 year after the bariatric surgery, we did an MRI study to assess brain connections. We found that the stronger connections in the brain. So you have a stronger brake system when you are depressed. And it's such that you have the less emotional or mindless eating. So what our future experiment, what we plan to do is, I already mentioned a lot of this, that brain response, and then that we only have follow up the patient only up to a year. And then that I also show you how the gut hormone affect the brain and how the brain responds to all these signals. Another thing, we are ongoing, and we haven't published, is that how our gut microbiota and how the metabolites would affect the peripheral hormone or affect the brain function. And that, and then also we will follow up these to a longer term, such as 2 years or 3 years, because that would be very important. And that's why we need to do this microbiota, because diversity and abundance of microbiota decrease in obese subjects. Many studies already shown that the people after the surgery, they change their distribution of the gut microbiota. But nobody ever do this that related to how the brain functional changes, and that's our goal. So why is it important? Because when we eat, a lot of these small part, the food eventually will be digested, and then the large part of our intestine actually has a lot of microbiota, and then they will start to do fermentation and then produce a lot of these small particles called short-chain fatty acid or amino acid, and then eventually will go through blood or go through many channels via the nerves and into the brain. And so that is a very important. So whatever you eat also will be affected by this process. And this microbiota also will be affected by whatever you eat. And so what is my talk today? Will give you some message you can take home. Obesity is associated with brain changes that make it harder to control craving and overeating. Those brain changes can be reversed through lifestyle changes, including exercise and mindful eating. More research on gut and brain interaction can treat and prevent overeating. So I thank you for your listening. And I also have to thank my colleagues. Those are the colleagues when I was in New York, Brookhaven Center for Translational Imaging, and also my colleagues in Maryland, Laboratory of Neuroimaging in that National Institute of Alcohol Use and Alcoholism, and my colleagues in China, in the Xi'an University, and the Xijin GI Hospital. That is the talk.
We're going to stop the screen share now. That was really interesting. Dr. Wang, did you only do the imaging studies on patients that had gastric bypass?
That's what I'm doing now.
So
it's my main research. Yeah.
So people that just suffered from obesity, they weren't part of the study. They would have had to have had gastric bypass.
Yes, yes. I had to focus my research, or else that if I spend too much, then difficult to correct the patients because that in my first study in the end of 1990s, I report around 11 subjects, and it took me 3 years to recruit them. And it actually almost 5 years for me to complete the project.
Yeah. So why are you so interested in this particular field?
Well, it's actually for myself. Yeah, because I pretty chubby when I was young. And so I want to know why I always eat more than other people, and that why every time I try to eat less, however, I just still eat more than other people. And that, and then gradually, when I get older, that I even develop a lot of medical problems. And so that is like my long-term goal. Please, I take care of myself, and in the same time, I take care of other people.
Wow. Is it easy to get participants to participate in this research?
Not easy. Not easy. As I mentioned to you, the first study I did, it took me 5 years to complete. And then subsequently, I study many studies in New York. That also took me many years because that people always some kind of that stereotype doing this medical imaging. They receive radiations. They don't want to lie in the scanner too long. It's a kind of the scanner pretty tight to them, and so that's very difficult to recruit them. And many our subjects, they also has a lot of severe medical consequence. It's such that I cannot recruit them because then either I'm studying diabetes or I studied that obesity. So it become very difficult. So I would say maybe only 20-30% of the people they want to they call us and they want to participate in our study. They fit our inclusion criteria.
Wow, that's interesting. You mentioned that people that have obesity, they have more cravings as a result of the obesity. So how are brain circuits involved in obesity and linked to the pleasure that we get from food?
Well, remember that this is the system we're born with. Because we born with this is the system make us like to eat. Because if we only eat whatever make us just full, is not sufficient, because we need to eat a little bit more than what we need. Because in the past, we always a family. We need to eat more in order for us to survive. So we can go through this food deprivation period. And so this is eating so-called good food is always enjoyable. As such that we call that rewarding, and that also make us feel good. And that, however, that when now we are in the modern time, we most of the places in the world, food is pretty, is plentiful. We know that there are areas has still famine, but all the developed or developing countries, they already have a lot of food that is such that we overeat.
So do you think it's the food that changed? Because obesity didn't used to be an epidemic.
You are right. Because of that, many reasons. Number one is we have a lot of food. And number two is that our lifestyle change, and that we don't have so much time to prepare food. And usually we want to prepare food as fast as possible. And sometimes we don't want to prepare the food. And then we get the food from the market, and then that we bring it home. And then just in a short period of time, the food is ready and we can eat. And during the process that it makes us that to eat those food, usually if you buy from that businessman, they always want to make you to go back again. So they have to make it very palatable. It's such that you go back.
Hyper palatable.
And so this is a very important trick, right? So then that you always go through the places that make you like to go back, and you don't know whether that's good for you or not.
Why do you think that some people are more susceptible than others? Because I used to be obese, and I've changed my diet and lifestyle. That's how I handle the problem. But I have a skinny husband that can eat any kind of crap in the world, and he doesn't overeat, and he doesn't gain an ounce. We are opposite. My wife is very skinny, and when we get married, and I said I cannot eat that, and she feared that I'm kind of too picky, because she can eat almost everything. Then I told her, and then and gradually I used my scientific mind to explain to her why I cannot eat certain kind of food. Yeah, because she can eat everything doesn't mean I can eat everything. As I mentioned to you, I always very choppy, and then I like to eat dessert, and I like to eat sweet stuff, and I like to eat those food that actually my wife, she doesn't eat. And so that so her siblings are, I always laugh at them that they are like a stick. And so we born differently. And so that some people are more vulnerable and some people are not. And so we cannot see everybody the same. We born differently. No, not fair, is it?
Not fair.
Not fair.
Also, everybody have their own strength and weakness. And that's our weakness, but turned out it can be better too.
Right, right. So Susanna, who's watching live, wanted to know, when the bariatric patients that you studied, were they eating a specific diet before the surgery, and did any of them change their diet at all after the surgery?
They did not have too much of the change on their diet. However, it's interesting is that after the surgery, they did change their diet themselves because they don't like to eat those kind of food. As I showed you already, we give them that high calorie food compared to low calorie food. A month after that, they don't like the high calorie food. And the reason is that because the hormone change and they affect the brain response. And that's the reason we use that bariatric surgery as a model to let us understand why is so effective. So then we can use the knowledge to do also, we call that is reverse engineering, that we can develop non-invasive procedures to help people.
That's what I was thinking. Could you use the research to find ways to do it so people don't have to have that?
The extreme method tell us that now we have a chance. If we use the right means, then we can help the people, because it's not easy not to eat or eat less. It's not easy.
Yeah. Yep. I work with a lot of people that are struggling with this, so that I'm very interested in this subject. What are some of the misconceptions around dieting and obesity you wish that especially people who weren't scientists understood better?
Well, it's that eating less is not easy, and that it's not necessarily effective. So eating less can be actually increase that your grading, the hormone I mentioned to you that make you feel hungry. So then people end up that they binge later. So I think that what you eat, how you eat, and when you eat matters.
Yeah. Do you think that people that struggle with this problem, they're less sensitive to the effect of dopamine, or they require more dopamine? Because I heard you say in one of your talks about downregulation of dopamine receptors. What role does dopamine play in this struggle for people?
Well, the dopamine, as I mentioned to you, is related to our motivations and then that motility. And so it also related to our reward. So when it downregulate, it's such that it also involved with the so-called decrease our inhibition control. So when we have the impulse, think about that. When you are driving the car, it's very important is that you put the pedal to increase that the speed of the car. However, we know that the most important of the driving is you have to put your feet into the brake. The brake is called inhibition control. So then the dopamine, especially the so-called dopamine D2 receptor, that involved of that inhibition control. So they have the less of that. Then that means that they have problem to inhibit. So even they have a less compared to the normal with their impulse, but their impulse is still overcome their inhibition control. So it's such that they cannot stop their desire. That's a big problem.
Yeah. You know, you mentioned earlier, it's not easy to eat less. I'm curious if you're at all familiar with Dr. Barbara Rolls at Penn State University and her work on volumetrics.
I forgot exactly.
The reason I ask is because I found the way that I was able to reverse my obesity wasn't by eating less, but was by eating more, but following her principles of calorie density, whereby giving up things that were very high calorie and high fat, like processed foods, and focusing on foods that had a huge volume to activate my stretch receptors, like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes. I was able to lose weight without actually eating less food, but actually by eating more food.
Yeah, actually that I mentioned to you before that what you eat and how you eat and when you eat matters. Why I say that? Because that the food contents, people say that, well, if I eat this, I just drink the soda. Soda has the sugar, and sugar has the energy. But remember, when you eat the orange, and orange is so big. I always use an example. If I give you a glass of the orange juice, so you can drink it very easily. But if I tell you that how many oranges need to make that orange juice, you may say that around 5 or 6 oranges, right? Then I ask you, can you eat 6 oranges? You definitely say no. Now, you lost the chance to help yourself. Why? Because when you choose this orange, it not only induces the energy, the orange juice you want, also introduce the fiber. Those fiber would inhibit or slow down the absorption of this orange juice into your blood. And you also help your friends, because these microbiota are your friends. They start to do their work. They start to do their metabolism, they do fermentation, and they would produce beautiful things, such as short-chain fatty acids. And that these short-chain fatty acids can be used as energy. Also, they can be used as a factor to inhibit your appetite. So you eat a lot, the volume never really change, and then you eat whatever you want, but you get more than what you need.
Well, it seems like the processing of food and the removal of fiber plays a role in people's weight.
Exactly. That. Well, you ask me why these 40, 50 years all of a sudden change so much. Because we change how we eat food. And that's how this is how we learn from a study of the people with substance use disorder. Because a lot of these substances are actually made from the plants. Cocaine made from plants, alcohol made from plants. They purify, become very small particles, easier to get into our body. And once it get into body too fast, and it's become very rewarding and actually become very toxic to us. And same thing, you make the food become too small, or you modify it and make it become not good for you.
Right. Well, so I once interviewed someone, he was actually a gastric bypass surgeon, who encouraged people to not have gastric bypass surgery and said, instead of me making your stomach smaller, let's make the food bigger. And by that, he meant foods that are high in fiber that will take up a lot more space in your stomach, but provide you with nutrition at a lower caloric intake.
Yes.
Yeah. So Bethany, who's watching live, wanted to know, what advice would you give someone who is considering having weight loss surgery?
Well, remember that I mentioned that the weight loss surgery is in my talk here is that I not necessarily I encourage the people to go to the weight loss surgery. However, you need to talk to your doctor first. Okay. For the decade of research have shown that exercise and being mindful eating of what you eat were still the 2 most important way to keep healthy. I mentioned the bariatric surgery today because studying people who had procedure was a great way to better understand that brain and gut relationship. So I mentioned about bariatric surgery doesn't mean I encourage the people to go to the surgery. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And Kathy, who's also watching live, says she heard that patients who undergo bariatric surgery lose their gut microbiome. And does the gut microbiome reappear? And does this bypass the effect of the gut-brain connection? So how are they affecting this by taking out part of their stomach?
It's very interesting that this is our ongoing project. We haven't published, but I have some kind of clue. Actually, the surgery, the method I use is that gastrectomy I mentioned to you. that actually it affects the flora in that, the microbiota in that the patient after the surgery, actually a month after the surgery already changed. And that, and then we also found that the metabolites they produce, actually it could be many factors, but one of them is from them, and then some of them from our body response to that is less. It changed the metabolites in these patients. And so that, for example, that they changed people, not from us reported, they changed that the short-chain fatty acid, they increase short-chain fatty acid, or they changed that some of the amino acid. And so this already been reported, but we haven't published yet. So those I just tell you that other people's publication, and that what are almost ready to publish is that they do affect our brain, especially when it responds to that food cue. Yeah.
Right. The work that you have published and that you're going to publish, if somebody wanted to look at it, where would they find it?
You see, I had to publish that very academic kind of research report. My colleagues and I, we are writing a review article for one of the journal inside the Nature. And we are going to submit that maybe at the end of this month. So it's not ready. So maybe come out that it will be published maybe early next year. This is that we review that all the publication in the past that 5 years, and then also how all kind of treatment of the obesity, how they affect the brain from the view of that medical imaging. And because I focus on the medical imaging because that's my specialty and my colleagues. Yeah.
Right. Well, I'd love to, link to any research you have because I think people find that interesting. Yeah. Dr. Wang, do you consider addiction a disease, a brain disease? And do you believe that for some people, food can either be addictive or have an addictive-like process?
Well, addiction is a disease, especially for that the substance use disorder. And that so we talk about the substance use disorder. Initially, the terminology called that drug use disorder. And then because of, we found that a lot of over or compulsive behaviors are very similar to this drug compulsive use behavior. So gradually that in the scientific field, instead of called drug use disorder, people name it as substance use disorder, including some of the substance. Because of when you process food into a very, very high refined process, and then that the food sometimes make people overeat, and then that becomes an issue. All right, but traditionally we don't call food addiction because it's become very confusing, and people academic field people instead they want to say that is that refined food addiction will be more scientific way. So you won't confuse the food because food is good for us and we have to eat food or survive. And now you say food is addictive, then nobody dare to eat food anymore. So we need to define better. And so that so instead that in scientific field we try to avoid this kind of misconception. But we know that once the people, they eat wrong food items to them, then that is become addictive. And then we know addiction is extreme form of the habituation. So then that is very unfortunately if that food that you feel comfortable, those are not good for you, then that become very harmful.
So maybe we just need a better name for it, because I don't think of food as addictive, but I think for some people, processed foods like sugar, for example, could be addictive.
Exactly. And that there was a publication way back with my good friend, Dr. Hobo. He passed several years ago. He was a professor in Princeton, and he did an animal study showing that if you treat the animal intermittently with the sugar, and the animal, they're addicted to sugar. And they show symptoms very similar to the drug use disorder.
Yeah, that is so interesting. What most surprised you about your research?
Well, but actually is that I find that is, I mentioned to you that it helped me. I never expect that that's so helpful to me, because of I interested in that using this modern medical imaging method to study our brain, because that at the time when I graduated medical school, finished my training, the medical imaging linked with the computation method is so amazing. It would help us to understand the brain when the person is still awake. And so by talking to the person, and then by seeing their when they are awake, and then we can do a lot of manipulation, and then see how they respond to our challenge, and then let us to know how their brain changes, and then we can further to understand the disease process. Just like when we want to understand the heart, we need to do stress test. Instead, we use the task. We use that drug, or we use that food, and to challenge the person, and then let us to understand the brain. And so that is very interesting for me, and then end up it become very helpful to myself.
Yeah. How do people help people with addictions? Other addictions, drugs, alcohol, for example.
Well, we know that a cure is a very important issue. So that if you know that your friend has an issue with eating behavior, let's not take them to eat buffet. We know that we always memory built in when we grow up. Then for the obese person, usually for us, people, they have lean person, they always eat one plate in a buffet. However, that the person, they obese, they always eat 4 or 5 plates. And so instead of eat in a regular restaurant, or go to your house, or eat their house, and then we eat the food we know we limit it to some amount, and we know we eat it very healthy and good for you and good for me. However, you take them to eat those places, is not good for them. This environment become toxic to them. It's not toxic to you, but toxic to them. And so we need to know environment is very important.
I want to kiss you right now.
Don't kiss me. I just want to hug you.
No, because I have been saying, we've never met before, and I don't know much about you other than the YouTubes that I watched. And I have been saying for over 10 years, if it's in your house, it's in your mouth. And I've always told people what I learned from the doctors that I work with, that you must work harder on your environment than you do yourself. And people don't understand, why don't you want to go on cruises? Why don't you want to go to restaurants? Because I may look slender now, but my brain is still obese.
I agree. I always talk to my colleagues that the patient, people they are obese, once they receive the treatment, it doesn't mean their brain become normal body weight. We put a terminology called post-obese. Post-obese brain is different from normal, and there's a likelihood they would reverse back to the obese. And we heard about yo-yo symptoms, and that because of their brain still very flexible, and that we need to help them. And so this is a good friend for.
I've never heard of that post. So where can I find out more about post-obese brain? That's the first time I've heard that, but it makes a lot of sense.
It was published maybe 20 years ago by a group in Arizona. There was a branch in NIH, They have the regional center in Phoenix, Arizona. And that group right now is not exist anymore, but they published several very important obese papers, and they are brought out this so-called post-obese, this terminology. I was very amazed at the time I was studying that my career in obesity, and I saw that terminology. I say I feel so amazed that they already found out that we born differently, and then we need to respect each other's difference.
That is very fascinating, and I want to know more about that. Because I work with people, that struggle to lose weight, and so many of them do, but it seems the recidivism rate of people gaining the weight back, and sometimes even more, is quite high.
Yeah, is that it's very important that we need to develop some kind of lifestyle that we feel comfortable with, and it's such that we know we can stick on it. And so we don't want to develop a goal. It's too complex or it's not good for us. And so that the goal is that too difficult to reach, eventually we'll give up. And then we'll feel that nothing helpful, and then I'm doomed, and then you become depressed, and then you go back to eat again. So that's why I mentioned many times that the surgery really fixed the problem, but it's not good for everybody. And actually, we don't need that. If we are not reaching into that state, then we can find some means, and we can still enjoy eating, and we can enjoy our life with our friends. And then that I think that's the most important. And for me, as a doctor, I still prefer that.
Nice. I don't know if you can answer this question, but it's an interesting one from Carolyn. Does COVID affect our gut microbiome and hence our gut-brain connection?
Maybe, but I'm not an expert. I'm not field, so I cannot extend my research into that.
Yeah. How do we get people to be more compassionate, if you will, for people with any kind of problem, whether it's obesity or a drug addiction or alcohol addiction? Because I feel like there's often a judgment that it's not a disease, that, that, you know what I'm saying?
I understand. Actually, as I mentioned to you, that we born differently. Actually, that NIH has a project called ABCD, is adolescent behavior cognitive development. And that design of that study was a result of many people like our group, that we know that the people, they develop the substance use disorder, the disease way back to when they were young. I mentioned to you the so-called habit formation period. That's when we were very young. And that my colleagues and I, we work on part of this data collect right now already into the 3rd years. We collect that, we analyze the data for the first 1 or 2 years. We found that people already show different. And that some people, they are easier to develop into obesity. Some people, they are easier to develop the so-called attention deficit, hyperactive disorder, and many, many other issues. So we are different. And so then that some of these people, they are easier to develop into that obesity. Then we need to help these people from their child and that have the better lifestyle. And the better lifestyle, once it formed, and then the easier for them to go back. If the person that start their cigarette smoking at the age of 8, by the age of 28, ask them to quit is very, very difficult, almost impossible. So anything formed in the very early stage, always very important.
Yeah. So it sounds like the longer you've suffered with an addiction, the harder it's going to be to kick it.
Exactly, because it kind of like you use iron to touch into your brain and make your brain always thinking, using that method to solve your problem. And that means addiction. It's not only a habit, it's become severe form of the habit. It's called addiction. Very, very difficult to untangle.
It sounds like the earlier you develop it, the harder it is as well.
Exactly.
Which is so sad when you see, I was fat from the age of 5, but nowadays, and I was like the only kid in my class, but now so many young children are overweight and even obese. So they're developing these habits much earlier. So it seems like maybe for them, it's going to be harder to break.
Yeah, I have the same problem like you. And that, as I mentioned to you, I was very chubby when I was a kid. And my classmates always laugh at me. And now we have the class reunion that I find that I are skinnier than them, many of them.
I know. Good for you. I found the same thing at my 40th.
They won't call me fatty anymore. They call me a skinny.
Oh my God, that's wonderful. It's
I'm very proud of myself.
Oh, I love that. So when it comes to any addiction, whether it's alcohol, drugs, gambling, maybe food, if you will, do you think an addiction can be truly overcome or just managed?
I would say managed. Just like hypertension, all the people already have diabetes. Don't trust yourself too much. Some people, they feel that, well, I have hypertension, now my blood pressure back to normal. But the doctor always mentioned to you, you need to come back to do follow-up. All right, so you need to check your blood pressure, you need to check your blood sugar, and don't be too excited, and all of a sudden you eat the wrong food, and then your blood sugar just pop up one day, and then subsequently, and then your memory returned, and then that your blood sugar keep going on, and then it become a toxin, and then your blood vessel changed, and then it become very difficult to recover. Mm-hmm. Because it become inflamed, and inflamed become a big fire. It's very difficult to make it go away. Yeah. So don't bet on yourself that much. We still have to follow a very good lifestyle and check with your doctor all the time.
Right. Do you think there's a genetic link with addiction? And could that help somebody, for example, if they knew they were predisposed to alcoholism, maybe not to take that first drink?
It's very interesting. Actually, we did a study many, many years ago with the people, they have the family history of the alcoholism. We call that father with that history of alcoholism instead of mother, because mother may affect the fetus. So we only take the fathers and their children. We found that's very interesting is that many of these children, they did not develop into the alcoholism, right? Or we call that alcohol use disorder. And that we found that very surprisingly, they have a very different brain from normals. Why they have different? Instead of they have the low dopamine D2 receptor I mentioned to you, they have the higher dopamine D2 receptor. We were shocked. That means that they have very, very strong brake system in them. Then I interviewed many of them. One of the kids reminds me very vividly already 20 years ago. And he told me that from childhood, he watched his father suffering. So from his young mind, he already know that I don't want to be like my father. I don't want to be like my father. I don't touch any alcohol. I would do good. I would do good everything. And then that he become very cautious on whatever his father make him feel so frustrated. And then turn out, he become a good kid. And when he was asked that he was, I think he was a medical student, I think. And he was very proud of himself. And also very proud of him because he helped us to understand this is an unknown secret in them. And so obviously the behavior really helped them to overcome their genetic issues.
Interesting. What people are seeking when they engage in addictive behaviors, is it dopamine? And if so, is there a way to just get it naturally and healthfully?
Well, remember dopamine in part make you go, and then in part also help you to stop, right? So you keep going, and then that eventually you get used to it. We call that so-called down regulations. And then that your breath keep wear out, then you cannot stop. And then that it takes you time to recover. And so that is that opposite of the story I mentioned to you. Instead that you try not to overuse your impulse, and then make your break very sharp. And then you become you enjoy your life very much because a little bit of that reward, and you feel good. You don't need to, you see, actually, it's very interesting is the substance use disorder, for example, cocaine use disorder. Many of these patients told me that to use the cocaine is not really enjoyable anymore. They need to use it in order for them to have the normal life. This is the worst story I heard. It's not necessary. It's good for them. You know what I mean? So it's not necessary that to use those substances bad for them, make them feel good now. Actually, to help them to carry out the life we recognize as normal. We enjoy sunshine. We enjoy the sunrise, sunset. For them, in order to enjoy sunrise and sunset, they need to make efforts.
Yeah. Do you think you'll ever write a book?
I'm a scientist. Maybe after retire, I'll work with my daughter on that. I have more time because I too work on this the heart issues, and then hopefully before I retire, I can get into more scientific research, and hopefully I can be more useful to help the people that have substance use disorder issue.
Do you think that the work you're doing with the imaging on people that have had gastric bypass surgery may give some answers on people with other types of eating disorders, like binge eating disorder or anorexia even?
Yes or no, because that it may be a little bit stretched too far, because all these issues involve some other mechanisms. So it's on top of what we are studying. Yeah, we know that the binge eater has a very similar problem like the overeating issues, but they have some other issues beyond that. And that people with anorexia, nervosa, they also have the very similar mechanisms. However, they also have some other issue on top of that. So my colleagues that in this field, they develop into a very important research to untangle those issues, and that is not my field. So I don't want to step too much into their expertise.
Right. Well, I find this very, very interesting, and I thank you so much for your work.
Thank you very much.
It was so enjoyable talking to you, Dr. Wang.
Yeah, thank you. You have chance for me to talk to your audience, and that I can be helpful to them and to you.
It was very helpful, especially the part about the cues. That was my favorite part.
Yes,
thank you so much, Dr. Wang. And thank you to Laura, who arranged this wonderful interview. And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back tomorrow when my guest is Theodora Scarato. She's going to be talking about cell phones, electromagnetic fields,